it is my pleasure to introduce you to Al Stavitsky, who is the Dean of the Reynolds School of Journalism at University of Nevada, Reno. And I have to say, Al has been to many of these programs. I think this is your first presentation, correct? First presentation. So I put Al on the spot to really address what is a timely topic right now, which is journalism and how that role of whatever we call journalism plays in national security issues. Now we're doing a slightly different format. Al will talk for about 20 minutes, and then Ray Hofstetler, our very own Ray, who you've heard from before, will give you the counterpoint, the intelligence perspective. Once we've heard a lot about the need for openness, transparency, and journalistic reporting, Ray will remind you of some of the issues that we in the national security community grapple with about how to keep secrets in this new era. So with that, you saw Al's bio, so I won't go into it. With that, I welcome Al and hope you are well engaged in this program. And I want to see how many people are going to be tweeting during this meeting. Yeah, okay, so you got the other demographic. But you must have at least one student here who tweets, right?
That's right. Or podcast. Nesta will do a podcast.
Podcasting. So, Al, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and I'm really pleased to be up here. As Maureen noted, I've been out there many times. Not long after I came to town, almost 7 years ago now, Ty brought me to the forum, and I came a number of times with Warren, and everyone always made me feel quite comfortable out there. I don't know how comfortable I will be up here. Following a Navy SEAL, I understand. But what I'm going to try to do is in the 20 minutes, the 19 and a half minutes that I have left, kind of give you a graduate seminar on the state of the media. But first, let me just acknowledge, as Maureen noted, I'm pleased to have many university colleagues of mine here, current faculty, emeritus faculty with Warren, a graduate student. Would our university colleagues please stand or wave or be acknowledged? So we're all delighted to have so many friends from campus with us. And sort of an honorary university person, if I could acknowledge my wife, Kristen Lobicki, the First Lady of the Reynolds School of Journalism, sitting up in the front there. Okay, all right, so here we go, the seminar. I'm often asked these days about the media. You know, what do you think about the media? And I reply that there is no the media. And I'll return to this. If we were to say, to talk about the media as a collective, I mean, that implies an industry with shared values, practices, notions of professional but the media are unlike the auto industry, home builders, you name it. I think before the dawn of the digital age, you probably could make a rough argument that there was sort of a collective media sector. You had influential national news organizations, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CBS News. You had wire services, the AP, UPI, news magazines, Time and Newsweek that were very widely consumed. You had a healthy sector of local newspapers. Even in a town the size of Reno, you had competing newspapers. Back in that period, newspapers set the agenda in most cases for the broadcasters in terms of what was covered. Most everyone was reporting the same kinds of stories. There were differences on the editorial pages, to be sure. And politicians back then complained of unfair coverage, just as we see today. Remember Spiro Agnew's nattering nabobs of negativity when he was President Nixon's sort of designated attack dog on the media. But even with that, for the most part, there was a common understanding of the rules of the game and the role of the media, which was generally referred to as the press back then, and the role of the press in the democratic system was accepted. I mean, there was consensus that even though you might be occasionally angry, that there was an important role for the press. Well, let's fast forward to the present, and let me tell you a little bit why I don't believe that the term "the media" is a useful one today. Today there is a crazy quilt of media firms, so many different firms, so many different forms of media that it's difficult to define who's a journalist today, what is a news firm. And so what I'm going to try to do for you is, there it is I'm going to identify 5 sectors of media. And this isn't a perfectly clean typology. There's some overlap, as you will see. But I hope this kind of gives you a sense of what the contemporary media ecology looks like. And we use the term ecology these days, even the scientific term, because it really is a system that we're talking about. So, all right, number 1. We'll talk about the watchdogs. We often use the term legacy media these days. These are the long-standing media firms, that the ones who were around before the digital age, sometimes referred to as the mainstream media, sometimes referred to these days as the lamestream media in the vernacular of some. And we'll call that the first sector. So here again, you have your New York Times, the Post, AP, CBS, Wall Street Journal. These see their roles as watchdogs, independent journalists who seek to hold the powerful accountable. They practice what we call a journalism of verification, which is fact-based. Attempting to confirm information is out there. Clearly, they have editorial stances, and whether it may lean left, as in the case of the Times or the Post, or right, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, for the most part, there is a clear distinction between the news side and the editorial side. And these media firms sort of follow what we refer to as the social responsibility model. They see that they have an important role in the democratic system and seek to be fair and balanced. Okay, sector 2. This we're calling digital native media. Now, you may have heard the term digital natives. So when we talk about digital natives, we're generally talking about young people who've come of age, in the digital environment. So they didn't know a time before the internet and before smartphones and the like. And so when we talk about digital native news firms, we talk about those entities that were born in the digital environment. So these were developed as websites or as apps or podcasts or whatever. So Politico, BuzzFeed, among some of the more prominent ones that we talk about here. Many of them share the mainstream values we talked about with legacy media, but there are some important differences. For instance, if we take a look at BuzzFeed, very prominently was really the only major news organization that published aspects of the Steele dossier, when some of those very salacious claims about Russian collusion and about the president that many of the traditional media shied away from. BuzzFeed went and published that. So here you're beginning to see some significant differences in operating practices and in values between the legacy firms and these digital native firms. Okay, the third sector we're calling the journalism of assertion. And so we're using assertion, sort of differentiating this from that journalism of verification that I referred to in that first sector. The journalism of assertion is opinion-based. It is dominated by commentary. This is the realm of talk radio. This is the realm of Fox News and of MSNBC. Breitbart. Here, traditional lines between news and opinion have blurred. This really is a sector that was driven by the rise of talk radio, which has really kind of crowded out traditional news journalism from commercial radio now. Public radio is a very separate thing, and we can talk about that as you wish. But talk radio kind of set a model that was then picked up by Fox News, MSNBC, and increasingly CNN. Fox News, if we talk about them for a second, is probably the most prominent exemplar of this. The title implies a news channel. Their slogan very prominently, "We report, you decide." There is a news department with some very veteran journalists, some of whom came over from legacy media firms. But I would argue that Fox's impact these days comes primarily through its hosts, through Hannity, Tucker Carlson, formerly Bill O'Reilly before he was toppled in the Me Too scandal, and the host of Fox and Friends, who take generally a pro-administration stance. It's very well known that Hannity is a close friend of the president. They speak frequently on the phone. Bill Shine, who was a Fox News exec, now is running communications in the White House. Fox and Friends is regular watching for the president, and frequently he will tweet about topics that he sees on Fox and Friends, and often that will drive then policy initiatives out of the White House. It was very interesting on the day a couple of weeks ago when both Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen had their cases in court, because you really saw the tension on Fox between the news side and the talk side and the opinion side, in which the journalists were reporting on those cases as a serious blow to the administration, while on the commentary side, the hosts were largely treating the events as unconnected to the president, and were saying, sure, these cases happen, but they do not demonstrate collusion and the like. So it's interesting to note that that this distinction between sort of the news side and the commentary side is really lost on a lot of viewers, or it doesn't matter to them, whether we're talking about Fox or maybe MSNBC as sort of an analog on the left. What's interesting is that the polling on media trust these days finds that that many folks who self-identify as conservatives believe Fox to be a far more credible, unbiased news source than the traditional legacy media sources. So it speaks to this situation how sort of the conceptions about what's a journalist, who's a journalist, and traditional distinctions between news and commentary are breaking down in this new world. Fourth sector, which we'll call the social sector. And this is driven largely by citizens, not professional journalists. This is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Professional media clearly do participate in this sector. The reach of social media demands that everyone have a presence, so you'll see your favorite media outlets are all represented on Facebook, whether they're big or small firms. But this is primarily the realm of non-journalists, and including, of course, many politicians, most notably the president, who are using social media to bypass traditional media, particularly the legacy sector, and going directly to their audiences. So this has become a very important theater for the formation of public opinion, which is why the Russians targeted it in the 2016 election, and why Mark Zuckerberg and his fellow moguls have become controversial figures and have been trotted up to Capitol Hill to talk about their algorithms and is there bias in the way they manage their news feeds. So, speaking of the Russians, that leads us to our fifth sector, and this is the attack dogs part of the program title, Watchdogs to Attack Dogs. These are the propagandists, the Russian hackers, the conspiracy theorists, and the like. Alex Jones, very prominent among them. You may be familiar with or read the stories about his InfoWars website and app. It was recently removed from Apple's App Store. He was banned from Twitter. To many of us, the conspiracies that are distributed by Jones and his ilk, like Pizzagate and the like, may seem ludicrous, but it is seen as sufficiently credible to some people, including the North Carolina man who drove to Washington, D.C. and shot up the pizzeria from which Hillary Clinton was allegedly running a pedophilia ring. So while many of us may not take this seriously, this is a sector that does have credibility with many people. So this brings us full circle in my last couple of minutes here, which is to come back to the question of what is journalism today and who is a journalist. To the Pizzagate shooter, Alex Jones is a journalist and is more credible than Bob Woodward. To folks on the left, Fox News is not about news, but is really a den of Trump apologists. To Trump supporters, the New York Times and the Washington Post are purveyors of fake news, as well as failing businesses. So at a time when the country is so clearly divided, we're also experiencing major change in the structure and nature of media firms, and the rise of these new media players has created a new marketplace of ideas. And I haven't addressed national security directly this morning, but that's because I see the changes in our media system that I've described impact all forms of news, whether it's news about foreign policy, secure borders, healthcare, the Supreme Court nominees. Many citizens are choosing to get their information from non-mainstream sources, from sources that may not adhere to the traditional journalism of verification. This poses a great challenge for traditional journalists and for my colleagues and I in journalism education, as we are struggling daily to understand this new environment and to figure out what it means for our training of the next generation of journalists. But I want to leave you with a positive note, and that is to say that in many ways, despite all the changes and all the challenges, these are the best of times for journalism. There is seemingly limitless information on demand, and right here in our pockets. Journalists are reinvigorated by this American moment, and we are seeing increased enrollment in journalism schools all across the country. So I assure you, as I conclude here, that we will stay on top of things, and we'll keep fighting the good fight and preparing the next generation of journalists to get you the information that you and we all need to participate in democratic society. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Al. We really appreciate your insight into defining for us what is journalism. To tie it directly to national security, so we asked Ray to come up and remind everybody of the other side of the coin, the perspective that we are also in this era with all these multiple sectors and a very complex ecosystem, trying to keep secrets. And sometimes we are successful and sometimes we are not. So with that, Ray, your perspective.
All right. Well, thank you, Dean Stavitsky. Your presentation was most enlightening and a little discouraging for me because I think that our ship of state leaks from more places than I had previously realized. And for some of the comments that I have after that presentation, you might think that this is just grumping from the shadows. But let me assure you that I think there are legitimate concerns today in the national security establishment that we have about the workings of journalism and the media. We are blessed to live in an open society, but we also live in a hostile world. This was recognized by the Founding Fathers, who determined that the first duty of the President of the United States was to serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. And in performing this task, George Washington, as well as others, recognized the need for secrecy. Throughout our history, secrecy has been in conflict with the need for openness and an informed public. There are four general areas where I'll suggest that governmental secrecy is warranted today. The first is military operations where lives are at stake. For example, the raid on Osama bin Laden. The second is advanced military technology, where surprise confers a battlefield advantage. The third is diplomatic discussions which could not occur without secrecy, like the strategic arms limitation talks or Nixon's opening to China. And the last is intelligence sources and sensitive collection techniques, which would be lost if compromised. Do you think these are the only areas where secrecy exists? We have trade secrets, we have sealed court decisions, and we have health privacy laws like HIPAA, where willful disclosure can draw fines and up to 10 years in jail. And of course, there are secret media sources, like the White House official who authored the New York Times op-ed of September 6, describing the quiet resistance to the policies of President Trump that set off a furious round of recriminations and denials. National security secrets are protected under four major laws: the Espionage Act of 1917, the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, the Comment Act of 1950, and the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982. According to the Supreme Court, the media is not excluded from the secrecy requirements of these laws. For example, in 1984, Samuel Loring Morrison, the grandson of the great naval historian, provided a KH-11 satellite photograph of the Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the British publisher Jane's Fighting Ships. He was prosecuted and convicted. He appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court on the basis of the First Amendment, arguing that the recipient of the secret information was not a foreign power, but was a publication. Justice Byron White wrote the decision, which said in part that neither reporter nor source is immune from conviction for such conduct, whatever the impact on the flow of news. He went on to write that the First Amendment does not confer a license on either the reporter or his news source to violate valid criminal laws. If national security secrets are protected by law, why do we read about so many of them in the newspapers? I will suggest two reasons. First, the laws don't work. The second is that reporters enjoy a privileged position in American society. U.S. reporters command extensive access to national security organizations. They get regular background briefings that are intended to be a flow of information to the general public. But they also have extensive access to personnel in those organizations and are free to ask questions that would, in other countries, put them in jail. From these contacts, they can piece together stories even when there is no intentional leak. As an occasional briefer myself, I had instructions to answer as many questions as possible without compromising intelligence sources and methods. I also had instructions never to lie to the press. Instead, I was to reply, "No comment," which every journalist in Washington takes as confirmation. To give you a sense of how difficult it is to protect national security information, let me review 5 famous leaks. The first is Gamma Guppy. We have strange names on all these operational programs. The first is Gamma Guppy. This was a communications intercept operation in Moscow in the late 1970s and early 1980s. NSA eavesdropped on the conversations of Politburo members, including Secretary General Brezhnev, when they telephoned from their limousines. Jack Anderson exposed it in 1971, and the source was lost within 12 hours. Project Jennifer, the Glomar Explorer, was a high-tech ship built at a cost of $4 billion of taxpayer money. Its purpose was to recover the codebooks and warheads from a Soviet Gulf II ballistic missile submarine that sank in the Pacific Ocean. The initial attempt in July 1974 recovered half the submarine, which actually broke in half and the second half sank back down. The New York Times exposed the program in 1975, and the return mission for the other half had to be aborted. Ivy Bells. This was an underwater communications cable tap carried out in the Soviet Sea of Okhotsk by the NSA, the CIA, and a specialized Navy submarine. FBI agent Robert Hansen, a Soviet spy, compromised it in 1981, and it was lost. Similar taps in other areas were planned, however, until the Washington Post exposed the program in 1985, and they were canceled. SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. The Treasury and the CIA were tracking terrorist money transfers. One lead led to the capture of the leader of the 2002 Bali bombing that killed 182 people. The New York Times exposed it in 2006 and described the monitoring techniques. Stellar Wind, an NSA metadata surveillance program authorized in 2004, to examine phone and email records to discover terrorist networks through their communications patterns. It was exposed by the Washington Post and the Guardian in 2013. These were all legally constituted programs. The press was not exposing government malfeasance. These were all legally constituted programs, approved by the Department of Justice and briefed to Congress for oversight. In each case, senior administration officials, including the White House, attempted to prevent publication and the exposure of national security information. In each case, the publishers decided to run the stories anyhow. The president has no effective way to prevent the media from compromising secrets once they have the story. In several Supreme Court decisions, like the one written by Justice White, publishers as well as sources are subject to prosecution for breaking the law. In stories where the leakers have been identified, they have been prosecuted. But the publishers have not been prosecuted. Why is that? I think you have to accept the idea that the pendulum of public opinion has swung from the World War II era that condoned the War Powers Act and the extensive press censorship that stemmed from it, to the post-Vietnam Watergate era in which trust of government is at a low ebb. The result is that while leakers are published, prosecution of the media carries too high a political price. The result is that they are not published no matter what the law says. In my political game plan, if you can solve the immigration problem for this country, you may be skilled enough to tackle the problem of secrecy in an open society and give the president as much authority to protect national security secrets as he has to protect your health records. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. The good news is that we're not very close to solving the immigration crisis, so I think we have time on the journalistic side. I'm going to pull this back so that you can see our speakers. And that mic should work. So I'm going to start here. And thank you all for your questions. I have some fabulous questions up here. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth because some of these questions are definitely focused on both of you. Some are focused on one of you or the other. So I'm just going to pull the thread, Ray, from your last comments and then have Al enter into this discussion. There was a very simple question that was, when is leaking justified? And I'm going to follow that up and said, the other follow-on question was, have we forgotten the Pentagon Papers? Now, the one thing I know in this room is how many remember the release of the Pentagon Papers? Yes. Okay, so we don't have to explain what that is. I couldn't find a millennial in the audience the last time, so nobody may know what tweeting is, but they know what the Pentagon Papers are. So with that, Ray, start. Mic on.
Is it on now? Okay.
Yeah.
Fairly broad question. We'll end up with the Pentagon Papers. Our government leaks like a sieve. You cannot say that we don't have open government because there are hardly any secrets left. They leak out all the time. So that there is a process for releasing information, and during the Cold War, I was actually a part of that process. But the Soviet strategic threat and the Soviet strategic strength was basically a government subject. Because we had to collect that through secret sources, intelligence sources and methods, overhead satellites, comment, spies, and all that sort of thing. Academics did not have access to this information. This was all done by government. and it was deliberately placed in the public domain in general terms. I mean, you know, we didn't tell how we got the information, where it came from, but it was placed in the public domain, and your picture of the Soviet Union during the Cold War came from government. So government was making the public aware. This goes on routinely, and I will also say that there are internal checks and balances, and there are other cases that you may want to talk about, some more salacious than the ones I've mentioned, that in fact were checked within government long before they ever became public knowledge. And the Pentagon Papers is a good example. Throughout the Vietnam period, the American public had a very clear idea of how they wanted to decide on policy, all right? So there was a large opposition to the Vietnam War by the American public. There were protests. Lyndon Johnson actually decided not to run for a second term in March 1968. President Nixon was elected in early 1969 and started a major drawdown of U.S. forces in Vietnam. The strategy was already set and in effect. The Pentagon Papers did not come out until March 1971. They were, in fact, history. They did not influence U.S. policy actions on Vietnam. What they did was give everybody who'd been protesting a lot of ammunition that proved that they thought they were right to be opposing the war. So would the American policy have been different without the Pentagon Papers? Probably not. I will argue simply that the Pentagon Papers embarrassed a lot of people. They were a valuable source to the American public. They did not jeopardize any of the items that I'd listed on military operations or secret technology and so forth. They were, in effect, a valuable release to the American public that did no real harm to the American strategic process, but they were history.
Al.
I would approach that question by going back to the term I used earlier about the social responsibility model of journalism. So we talk of the press as the fourth estate and having a role to hold government accountable. And to serve that function, we provide the remarkable support of the First Amendment, which gives additional support and importance to journalism as opposed to other industries. In return for this, sort of the bargain, so to speak, is that that journalists will adhere to this social responsibility model and will seek to provide the citizenry with the civic information they need to fuel democracy, but at the same time will seek to, as Ray noted, protect government secrets where they believe that it's important to keep our intelligence personnel safe and protect military operations and secrets and the like. And I think we certainly know of many cases where journalists have held information that they've had, the Bay of Pigs being a prominent example of that, and other cases as well, at the request of governments when the government made what, in the view of the journalists, was a very good case that there were national security implications for this. So I think, for the most part, and we can argue about cases like Snowden and were some of the secrets that were released there, did that ultimately compromise military operations and the like? But that said, I mean, I think that this social responsibility model has served us well over the years. I think the problem increasingly, and I very much like your line, Ray, about the ship of state sinking from, is leaking from many more places now. I think the problem is now, in this new world where, there are a lot of questions about who's a journalist, what's a news firm, and the rules are different, the values are different from, media firms such as the Associated Press and the New York Times, and now some of these new digital operations and people who are operating through social media and talk radio and the like. So I think the game is very different nowadays, which very much complicates the world, and I think we saw that with Snowden and the whole WikiLeaks controversy.
Excellent. Thank you, Al. And to pull that thread, where can the UNR journalism students raise their hand? The students that are here. Thank you. The next generation. Al, I'm going to bounce to you several questions that tie into what you just said. You said social responsibility in journalism. Okay, so we're going to still, for this short period of time, live in the illusion that schools of journalism are the bastion of teaching that social responsibility of journalism. And as long as we're in that, then we're going to ask you some very specific questions about how you teach right now and what your teaching has changed. So I'm going to bounce out a few questions. You can answer them sort of all together. One is, how do you teach students about the role of reporting, what we call objective reporting versus activism reporting? What is the role of ethics and integrity, and how is that taught to your students? And how do you balance teaching liberal perspectives and conservative perspectives in your education system? What is it that you're communicating to this next generation of journalists? So with that, give us a little bit of insight into how the next generation of socially responsible reporters will come to be. Thank you.
Remember the old television show, it was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and they used to have the lifeline. You could throw out a lifeline. I have two colleagues in the room with me who teach Journalism 207, which is our basic reporting class. Professor Caesar Andrews over there, Donica Mensing, our associate dean. Do you guys want to talk a bit about 207 and the approach of...
We'll let you cover it.
Of that, or they're saying I'm happy since I'm already seated. Okay, all right. Well, what we talk about a lot is the need to blend the enduring values with the emerging, the values and techniques in journalism. So I think when it comes to reporting, I think the enduring values, accuracy, fairness. I mean, that still is the core of what it is that we teach. So I think in that sense, the basics of a reporting class, what Donica and Caesar and our other faculty are teaching, in those classes, has not changed that much over time in terms of, the essential values and practices. We're an accredited school of journalism, and there are what we call values and competencies that our accrediting body looks for when they review us for reaccreditation, and those have remained standard for many years. The at the same time, we talk about the emerging. So, you know, as I talked about, it's a very different world now, whereas before you train people to work for a newspaper, for a television station, you want to be a magazine writer. Now all of that stuff is sort of converged together. You know, and as you see it right now, you know, with your Reno Gazette Journal now, they talk about themselves as RGJ Media. And the newspaper's pretty thin, and a lot of that stuff you've already seen online before, right? So it's become, we're now living in a digital first world. And so a reporter goes out and, you know, whereas it used to be a reporter and a photographer, and in broadcast you had, you know, the reporter and a videographer and a sound person, and now it's usually one person gathering all that stuff and preparing something for the TV broadcast and for the website and then tweeting it out and the like. So obviously we have to prepare our students with that skill set as well. We have to teach them to be multimedia reporters. But I think the basics of reporting have stayed the same. And I think as one now, and one of the questions talked about ethics. One of the things we're very proud of is that we require all of our students to complete a class in journalism ethics. As a matter of fact, Professor Andrew Caesar holds our chair in ethics, which shows you the significance that we place in that. We require our students to take an ethics class. We require them to take a First Amendment class, which Warren taught for many, many years at the school and has now been passed on to some other terrific young faculty members. So we take that very seriously, and a lot of what's talked about then in those classes is that tension between objective journalism, which nowadays we talk more about fair and balanced reporting. We talk a lot about accuracy, but that is key to talking about how the world is changing, and therefore how a reporter needs to be the skill set that they need to go forward. So we're very clear that we are training, we're training journalists. We're not training people for the resistance in journalism, even though I think there are some people, who would like to see us do that.
Excellent, thank you. Ray, you had a comment on that.
Yes, you might consider this another grump from the shadows. But the United States government is in hard times in terms of credibility. And I want to suggest that despite my colleagues' comments, journalism faces the same problem. As the readership, the American public, is simply less interested and less trusting of fact-based and evidential reporting. You can't have social responsibility if nobody pays any attention to facts. Note the rise of fact checkers. It's bad for both of us, and I wish that I were as optimistic as you are.
Ray, thank you. And for those of you who don't know, I was remiss in reminding you that our grump from the shadows is the former executive director of the CIA, so he does know something about shadows. So with that, I will ask Ray a very specific question that is very timely, like yesterday, maybe this morning, although my phone's over there, so I haven't seen any tweets this morning. Can you comment on the president's decision to release classified information regarding the Russia investigation, and what does this mean when the president can declassify information in the midst of an investigation? What does that mean for journalism, and what does that mean for protecting secrets in an investigation?
Well, journalists will be in a lot better shape than intelligence organizations when he declassifies some of this, because there'll be great stories, but you do risk some losses of sources and methods, like how do we track Russian interference in elections? You want to blow that so they can do better on the next time? The president is the commander-in-chief. He has the absolute right to declassify anything he wants to for reasons that only he, in effect, has. He doesn't have to basically explain this to any of the other people in government. He does have to explain it to the public, but not to any of us who work for him. If he wants to declassify something, he's free to do so. My read on this is that this is part of the debate on whether or not he's being unfairly challenged by the Mueller investigation, and has very little to do with enlightening the public on details that are available in the classified arena.
Excellent, thank you. Al, do you have anything to say on the topic?
Nope, nothing to answer. Yeah, this.
Good, because then I'm going to give you the next hard question that you knew was coming, okay? And this goes under the title of bias in the media. Okay, so you gave us the watchdogs and the attack dogs and the breakdown of the ecosystem, which was great, and we all like to specify things, but the truth is that there's a lot of blurring in them. And so media outlets that many people think are what we call mainstream, objective, some of us believe are objective, like the New York Times. In my house, I read the New York Times every morning. My husband reads the Wall Street Journal, and then we compare notes on the stories, and it's not always the same. So how do you, when you're looking at the media, how do you make this differentiation? There's several things that are happening. One is traditional media outlets that held the role of watchdogs seem to be bleeding themselves over for whatever reason. You could call it liberal bias, you could call it conservative bias, you could call it reporters adding opinion into what should be reporting pieces. How are you, as a leader in journalism, dealing with this inherent bias, and is it real, or is it just something that we're being told repeatedly from our sources of news as happening to what we listen to?
I think to fully answer that question, we would have to have everyone enroll in Caesar's Journalism 305 class. But I think the ad deadline has passed for the semester, so that isn't going to work. Wow. Well, I mean, that is a huge question. I mean, that is a tremendously important question. Well, a couple of thoughts on that. You know, one thing, the president said the other day that, and I don't know where he got this statistic from, but he said something like, 90% of the stories about me are negative. And therefore that indicates, unfairness. And then I recall, in one of the, media blogs and trade publications that I tracked, somebody was responding to that by saying, well, some of these things, there's, we used to say, well, there's both sides of the story. Well, if you're talking about, some of these issues, is there another side? In other words, if you're reporting on the president through his personal attorney paid off adult film stars for, to hide these affairs coming to light before the election, therefore, so people say, well, that's a negative story, but is there another side? In other words, there are some stories where you can legitimately say, that, the media were unfair in treating that. Other things, well, these are bad stories, and it is not just Trump. I mean, Nixon during Watergate and things like that. So there isn't always, another side. And one of the things that concerns me a lot, and this gets back to your very important point, Ray, which I wrote down, that you can't have social responsibility when nobody pays any attention to facts, is that the president has sort of conflated fake news with stories that he does that are critical of him. And this, and this I think is one of the major problems where, if you have a story that is that journalism of verification that I talked about earlier, where the journalists have the facts nailed down, and you just say, well, that's fake news, and because it's a story that's critical. That's something that that worries me considerably, because there will always, presidents have to know that they will be criticized. There will be stories about them that they will not like, and some, maybe we can argue about whether it's fair or not. But if something has been verified, to then say, well, that's fake news and the media are biased. I mean, that's something that I find troubling. I don't know how much that answer speaks to that kind of broad question, but that's one stab I can take at it.
Yes, right.
Just a short comment. I think this is a utopian goal. An unbiased media, an unbiased newspaper is a utopian goal. If people want to get a view of what's going on, they have to read more widely, and they have to read many views. Never in the history of this country, I believe, has in effect a newspaper or a magazine had no bias, because in part bias is in the eye of the beholder. But there is something that I think is a real phenomenon, and that is that opinion leaders, whoever they may be and whatever their views are, opinion leaders are the ones that form public movements in this country. They are the ones that actually look on a more a broader level to find out what's going on. And people come to them and say, what should I think about this? How should I vote on that? And so on. So this country does have strong opinion leaders. The fact that we have a lot of readers who basically, a good many of them, really want to read to get reinforcement of the opinions they hold anyhow, and this is a well-known phenomenon that psychiatrists are studying these days, is not going to help make an unbiased newspaper or public media. It just can't be done. But the fact of the matter is, we should pay attention to opinion leaders and make sure they have as many facts as possible so that people who come to them for opinions, in fact, are well informed.
Excellent. Excellent point. I have time for one last question, and I'm going to bounce it out because it was timely with the congressional hearings we just heard. There's been a lot of discussion about social media, both influencing the United States and its influence in other countries. Obviously, the Arab Spring was the social media revolution. Where do you stand on, should social media be more regulated? How does it control or not its messaging? Al?
Well, I have a lot of problems with the idea of, we regulate social media. I mean, that then gets into quite a slippery slope, and there's all sorts of mischief can happen down the road there. Where I come down on is the more the more light we can shed on these things, the more reporting on how the algorithms work, and investigations of interference in social media, the more that we can help people understand the sector. Just to note one thing, about in our journalism school, I mean, obviously one important role is training the next generation of journalists, but also we increasingly see our role as being central to media literacy education across the campus and in the community. I mean, that's why I so value the opportunity to come here and speak to the public about some of these very arcane things that are happening in the media, because I think we are all engaged with social media, and so we all have to know, how it works. So I think more information is where I would go, rather than down a path of trying to come up with some regulatory scheme.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both for your perspectives. I know. Ray, yes, of course. You may have the last word.
Yeah,
Grump in the shadows.
Yeah. I think trying to regulate the content of the media is a feckless enterprise. This cannot be done. The social media, regular media, it's the same problem as trying to regulate secrecy in an open society, and you just can't do it. Now I'll give you a personal opinion. I think what you could do and consider doing, not only for people who leak secrets, but for people in social media that damage other people, is to treat them like the commercial enterprises they are. Give them a very stiff fine for damages, and you'd find a lot more responsibility in the social media.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Al, for a very stimulating discussion. I'm just going to put in one final plug, which is a personal plug. I don't know, how many people here have read John Meacham's book, Soul of America? Okay, a few. Okay, I would highly recommend that this audience read it. You can download it on your Kindle, you can buy it in hard copy, you can listen to it on an audiobook. The reason being is because he points out something that what we are going through right now in our presidency, some of which has happened many times before, and he talks about the role of media. But one of the most important things he talks about is the responsibility of the citizen to listen to different opinions. And I think he really goes to the heart of how we make our decisions in this country. So I will put in my plug for Media Source from an old school source. And with that, I will thank both Al and Ray for a stimulating discussion.